The entire structure of human consciousness had been carefully built over centuries to justify and maintain systems of oppression. These structures showed that the complex hierarchies of medieval society, often seen as natural and eternal, were actually fragile human creations that could be dismantled by human action. Through their violence, brutality, moments of inspiring vision, and tragic failures, these revolts revealed something vital about the human condition. They proved that no system of oppression, no matter how entrenched or seemingly natural, backed by force or sanctioned by religion, is ultimately more powerful than the human ability to recognize justice and demand something better. The blood shed in these revolts was not only that of lords and peasants. It was the blood of an old world dying and a new world fighting to be born. In that struggle, and in that terrible and necessary violence, we see the first signs of ideas that would eventually transform human civilization. The belief that all people have inherent dignity, that power should be justified rather than simply imposed, and that the meek might inherit the earth. These were the true lessons written in fire and blood across the medieval countryside. These were the truths that no amount of noble propaganda could fully suppress. From your script, summary, and reference materials, you've laid a strong foundation. About peasant revolts being strategic acts of psychological warfare. Medieval lords understood that allowing peasant uprisings to succeed, even for a short time, would destroy the entire foundation of their world. Their response was not just about crushing rebellion. It was about displaying dominance so completely and so horrifically that the very idea of resistance would be extinguished for generations. When the dust settled, and the makeshift weapons lay strewn across bloodied fields, the real education began. Lords didn't simply execute rebel leaders and return to normal. They staged a theater of terror that made the original revolt seem insignificant. Public executions became elaborate spectacles not just for killing, but to showcase the cosmic order that peasants had dared to challenge. The bodies of rebel leaders often faced the same ritualistic humiliation they had imposed on their masters. They were dragged through streets, displayed in cages, and drawn and quartered, while crowds looked on. This was not random cruelty. It was carefully planned psychological warfare meant to restore the mental structure of feudalism. Every broken bone and every scream of agony served as a lesson in the supposed natural order of things. More insidious was the collective punishment that followed. Entire villages involved in or supporting revolts faced crushing new taxes, forced labor, and restrictions that made their previous conditions seem generous by comparison. Children were taken as hostages to ensure future compliance. Harvests were seized, leaving communities on the brink of starvation. The message was clear. Rebellion didn't just bring death to the rebels. It brought suffering to everyone they claimed to represent. Yet perhaps the most devastating weapon in the Lord's arsenal was the manipulation of hope itself. They would often grant small concessions immediately after suppressing revolts, just enough to suggest that peaceful submission might achieve what violent uprising could not. A reduction in a particularly hated tax. Here, the dismissal of a cruel bailiff. There, these tiny gestures were poison disguised as mercy, meant to redirect peasant energy away from collective action and toward individual survival. The psychological impact of failed revolts extended far beyond the immediate participants. Survivors bore trauma that manifested as a deep understanding of their powerlessness. They had felt the intoxicating possibility of freedom only to have it violently snatched away. This created a unique form of despair, personal and political. They had seen behind the curtain of feudal power, realizing that while it could be challenged, the cost of doing so was often unbearable. However, the story becomes more complex than mere oppression and submission. The brutal suppression of peasant revolts often set the stage for future uprisings. By showcasing their willingness to use extreme violence to maintain control, lords inadvertently exposed the weakness of their position. They showed that their authority relied not on divine mandate or natural law, but on their capacity for cruelty. This realization had deep long-term effects. Each generation of peasants inherited not only the memory of failed revolts but also the understanding that the system could be shaken. The stories passed down weren't just warning tales about the dangers of rebellion. They were evidence that rebellion was possible. Children grew up knowing their grandparents had once made lords beg for mercy, even if they ultimately paid a steep price for it. The repression also created underground networks of memory and solidarity that proved impossible to completely erase. Former rebels, marked by their involvement but not executed, became living stores of tactical knowledge. They remembered which strategies had worked, which had failed, and why. They understood the significance of timing, coordination, psychological warfare in ways that no amount of theoretical planning could teach. Sophisticated and more targeted in its violence, they began to understand that fear was a weapon as powerful as any sword. Here's the continuation of your script, Part 5, emulating the tone, flow, and style of your reference materials. Yet even as these carefully orchestrated acts of brutality began to crack the foundations of feudal authority, the true horror lay not just in what the peasants did to their oppressors, but in what centuries of systematic degradation had done to the peasants themselves. When we look beneath the surface of these revolts, we discover something far more disturbing than mere violence. We find human beings who had been thoroughly dehumanized and completely stripped of their dignity. They had learned to see themselves through the eyes of their masters. Consider the psychological state of medieval serfs. A peasant was not simply poor or exploited. A peasant was legally defined as less than human. They could not marry without permission. They could not leave their lord's land. Their children belonged to the manor before they belonged to their parents. They were bought and sold with the estate like livestock or farming tools. For generation after generation, this was not just their economic reality, but their spiritual and psychological prison. When John Ball stood before the rebels at Blackheath and declared that Adam and Eve were created equal, he was not just making a political statement. He was performing an act of psychological warfare against centuries of internalized oppression. He was teaching peasants to see themselves as human beings created in God's image, rather than as the subhuman creatures their lords had convinced them they were. This is why the violence of peasant revolts specifically targeted the symbols and tools of their dehumanization. They didn't burn manor houses randomly. They sought out and destroyed the court rolls, the legal documents that recorded their bondage. They hunted down the stewards and bailiffs who enforced their daily humiliation. They forced their former masters to share meals with them as equals, reversing the social rituals that had reinforced their subordination. Perhaps most tellingly, they often compelled their lords to perform manual labor, to work in the fields like peasants. This wasn't simply revenge. It was an attempt to make their oppressors experience the dehumanization they had inflicted. For so long, the rebels understood that their lord's power came not just from wealth or military force, but from a carefully built system of psychological control that convinced everyone, including the peasants, that this hierarchy was natural and ordained by God. The tragic irony is that many peasants had so deeply internalized their supposed inferiority that even in revolt, they struggled to imagine a world without lords and masters. They often sought not to eliminate the feudal system, but to find kinder masters or to become masters themselves. The very concepts they used to organize their rebellions, the language they spoke, and the religious frameworks through which they understood their struggle, had all been shaped by centuries of subjugation. This psychological aspect explains why the revolts were so terrifying to the ruling class. It wasn't just that peasants were burning castles and killing nobles. They were attacking the foundations of medieval social reality. They suggested that the justifications for inequality, the divine sanction claimed by kings and lords, and the entire worldview that placed some human beings above others were nothing more than a fabricated fiction maintained by force. The lords understood that their power rested not just on their ability to inflict violence, but on their success in convincing their subjects that this violence was legitimate, even necessary. When peasants began to see through this illusion, when they treated their supposed betters as mere men who could bleed and die and suffer just like anyone else, the entire system was revealed to be built on nothing more substantial than shared delusion and normalized brutality. This is why the repression that followed peasant revolts was always so savage and systematic. It wasn't enough to simply defeat the rebels militarily. The ruling class had to rebuild the psychological structures of control. They had to convince peasants once again that resistance was not just futile but unnatural, that inequality was ordained by God, and that their suffering was deserved. The executions were public spectacles designed to restore the proper order of things. When Wat Tyler was cut down at Smithfield, when John Ball was hanged, drawn, and quartered, when thousands of rebels were hunted down and killed in the aftermath, these weren't just punishments. They were rituals of psychological reconquest, designed to repair the damage done to the collective imagination of feudal society. Yet, something had changed forever. The genie could not be fully returned to the bottle. The ideas unleashed by these revolts, the vision of a world where human beings were valued for their humanity rather than their birth, where labor was respected rather than degraded, and where justice was based on equality rather than privilege, would continue to spread and evolve. The peasant revolts of the medieval period were thus far more than political or economic protests. They were profound challenges to the profound. It shattered the myth of noble invincibility. It proved that the established order was not divinely ordained, but maintained by force. It planted the seeds of ideas that would eventually grow into democracy, human rights, and social equality. The brutality of peasant revolts was not an accident or side effect. It was the inevitable outcome of a system that treated people as property. When individuals are pushed beyond their breaking point and have nothing left to lose, they can become capable of anything. The violence was terrible, but also necessary. Here's part 4 of the YouTube script explaining why peasant revolts were so violent. We need to understand something crucial about the psychology behind this violence. These acts weren't random brutality committed by savage barbarians, as the chronicles suggest. No, this was calculated terror with a very specific purpose. Peasant revolts weren't just about getting better working conditions or lower taxes. They aimed to completely upend the social order, to bring the mighty down from their pedestals and grind their faces into the dirt. Imagine the situation from the peasants' viewpoint. For generations, your family was told that these nobles were your betters, that God himself had ordained their superiority, and that their blood was different, purer, more divine than yours. The entire feudal system rested on this lie of inherent nobility, this myth that some people were simply born to rule, while others were born to serve. But when desperate people finally rise up after being pushed too far, they don't just want to negotiate. They want to shatter that myth completely. They want to prove in the most visceral way that noble blood bleeds just as red as peasant blood. When you strip away the fine clothes, titles, and castles, these so-called lords are just as mortal and vulnerable as any common farmer. This is why the violence was intensely personal and deliberately humiliating. During the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, the rebels didn't just execute the Archbishop of Canterbury, Simon Sudbury. They dragged him from the Tower of London, forced him to his knees in a field, and then took 8 strokes with a blunt axe to hack off his head, while the crowd jeered and mocked his pleas for mercy. They wanted him to die not as a prince of the church, but as a common criminal. The rebels understood something that modern historians often overlook. In medieval society, honor and reputation were everything. A lord's power didn't solely stem from his armies or wealth. It came from the belief that he was inherently superior. So the peasants attacked that belief with surgical precision. They forced nobles to perform menial labor. They made them kiss the feet of commoners. They paraded them naked through the streets. Every act of degradation aimed to strip away the mystique of nobility. But here's where it gets really dark. The peasants weren't content with merely humiliating their oppressors. They wanted to traumatize the entire ruling class so thoroughly that the survivors would never forget what happened. They aimed to plant seeds of terror so deep that future generations of nobles would think twice before pushing the common people too far. This is why they often targeted symbols of authority with such creative cruelty. During the Jacquerie in France, peasants captured the knight Enguerrand and forced him to watch as they roasted his children alive before his eyes, basting them with fat as if preparing a feast. Then they made him eat a portion before finally killing him. It was psychological warfare of the most brutal kind. The rebels also understood the power of performance and spectacle. When German peasants captured Count Ludwig von Hohenstein during the Great Peasant War, they didn't just execute him. They forced him to run a gauntlet while peasants stabbed at him with pikes and pitchforks, turning his death into a twisted carnival that drew crowds from miles around. The message was clear. This is what happens to those who oppress us. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of peasant violence was its ability to transform ordinary people into instruments of terror. These weren't professional soldiers or hardened criminals. They were farmers and craftsmen, people who spent their days tending sheep or making horseshoes. Yet, when the moment came, they performed acts that would make seasoned warriors sick to their stomachs. Take the case of a miller named Hans Miller during the German Peasant War. By all accounts, he was a quiet, God-fearing man who had never raised his hand in anger. But when his village rose against their lord, Hans personally oversaw the torture of the nobleman's bailiff. He spent 3 days slowly skinning the man alive, keeping him conscious with wine and careful cuts, all while calmly explaining to the screaming victim why he deserved such treatment. This transformation reveals something terrifying about human nature. When people are pushed far enough and endure enough humiliation and suffering, they can become capable of almost anything. The medieval peasantry had been brutalized for so long that when they finally snapped, all that built-up rage and hatred poured out in the most horrific ways. And here's the thing that truly made the nobility panic. The peasants were learning. Each revolt became more was like to be powerless and treated as less than human. The rebels specifically targeted symbols of noble authority. They burned manor houses not just to destroy property, but to erase the very foundations of feudal power. They desecrated churches. Because the clergy had supported this system of oppression, they destroyed legal documents and tax records because these represented the bureaucratic machinery that kept them enslaved. Every act of destruction was deeply symbolic, a ritualistic cleansing of the old order. But what made the violence particularly vicious was that these weren't strangers fighting strangers. These were people who had lived alongside each other for generations. The peasant who split open his lord's skull with an axe had likely served that same lord's family for decades. He knew the man's habits, weaknesses, and fears. This intimate knowledge made the violence personal in a way that battlefield slaughter never could be. The psychological aspect of this violence is significant. For centuries, peasants had been told that nobles were their natural superiors, that God himself had ordained this hierarchy. Questioning it was not just rebellion but blasphemy. Overcoming that psychological conditioning required tremendous effort. When it finally happened, the release was explosive. Consider the case of Kale during the Jacari when his forces captured noble prisoners. They didn't simply execute them. They forced them to kneel in the mud like common serfs. They made them beg for mercy, using the same groveling language peasants had used for generations. They turned the social order upside down, even if only for a brief, terrifying moment. The rebels understood instinctively that their revolution must be total. Half measures wouldn't work against such an entrenched system. They couldn't just demand better working conditions or lower taxes. They had to completely shatter the psychological foundations of feudalism. They needed to show that nobles bled and died just like anyone else, that their supposed divine authority was merely an elaborate lie. This is why the violence was so ritualistic and theatrical. Peasants would dress in their victims' clothes, mocking the elaborate ceremonies of noble life. They would hold mock trials where they condemned their former masters to death for the crime of oppression. They forced captive nobles to serve them food and drink, reversing the traditional roles in a grotesque parody of feudal hospitality. The sheer intensity of this violence shocked even hardened medieval observers. Chronicles describe scenes that seem almost unbelievable. Peasants roasting nobles over slow fires. Rebels forcing captured knights to fight each other to the death. For entertainment, entire noble families exterminated with a brutality that left witnesses traumatized. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect was how quickly ordinary people turned into instruments of terror. These weren't professional soldiers or career criminals. These were farmers and craftsmen, people who had spent their lives creating rather than destroying. Yet when the moment came, they were capable of unspeakable cruelty. That's what centuries of oppression does to the human soul. It doesn't just create victims, it creates monsters. The rebels seemed to know their time was limited. They understood the established powers would eventually crush them, so they aimed to inflict as much psychological damage as they could. They wanted to plant doubt in the minds of every noble who survived, making them wake up every night wondering if their peasants might be planning something similar. In many ways, they succeeded. The trauma of these revolts echoed through noble society for generations. Lords became paranoid, constantly watching their servants for signs of rebellion. The easy confidence of feudal superiority was permanently shattered. Even when the revolts were crushed and order restored, something fundamental had changed. The illusion of natural hierarchy had been broken and could never be fully repaired. This psychological warfare was perhaps the peasants' greatest weapon. They might not have had the military strength to overthrow the feudal system permanently, but they could plant the seeds of its eventual destruction. Every act of violence against a noble was also an act of liberation for every peasant who witnessed it. proof that their oppressors were not untouchable. That change, however violent and terrible, was possible. The legacy of this violence extended far beyond the immediate participants. Stories of peasant brutality spread throughout medieval Europe, inspiring some and terrifying others. Nobles began to view their own peasants with suspicion and fear. The easy paternalism of earlier feudalism gave way to a more calculating, defensive relationship between classes, but the peasants paid a terrible price for their brief moment of liberation when the revolts were inevitably crushed. The retaliation was swift and merciless. Nobles who had been humiliated and terrorized took their revenge with interest. Entire villages were burned. Thousands were executed without trial. The survivors faced even harsher conditions than before, as their lords sought to ensure that such rebellions would never happen again. Yet even in defeat, the violence of these revolts had accomplished something. Endured for generations, the violence became a way to release pent-up emotions. It was a desperate effort to reclaim their stolen humanity through the complete destruction of those who had denied it. Take, for example, the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, where rebels did not just execute the Archbishop of Canterbury. They pulled him from the Tower of London and hacked him to pieces with farm tools. Their anger was so intense that they continued to mutilate his corpse long after he was dead. This was not strategic violence aimed at achieving political goals. It was primal, emotional violence born from decades of suppressed rage. Finally finding its outlet, the peasants understood, perhaps instinctively, that half measures would not work. The feudal system was not just an economic arrangement. It was a complete worldview that placed them as naturally inferior beings. Challenging it required both political rebellion and psychological warfare against the very foundations of the medieval social order. The violence aimed to shatter the illusion of noble superiority, proving that lords could bleed and die just like anyone else. This psychological aspect explains why peasant revolts terrified the ruling classes. The violence was not random or mindless. It was focused and symbolic, meant to humiliate and degrade the nobility in the same way peasants had been humiliated for generations. When rebels forced lords to serve them at the table or made them kneel and beg for their lives, they were actively reversing the power dynamics that had defined their existence. The rebels also understood that their violence needed to be total and uncompromising because they knew there would be no second chances. Medieval society provided no legitimate channels for peasant grievances, no gradual reforms or peaceful negotiations. If they failed to completely destroy the existing order, they would face brutal retaliation that would make their previous suffering seem mild by comparison. This created a desperate all-or-nothing mentality, fueling even greater extremes of violence. Furthermore, the peasants recognized that the foundations of feudal authority rested on the myth of noble superiority and divine sanction. Their violence was not just aimed at individual oppressors. It targeted the entire ideological structure that justified their oppression. By desecrating churches, burning manors, and publicly executing nobles, they attacked the symbols and institutions that had legitimized their suffering for centuries. The communal nature of this violence also served important psychological functions. After generations of isolation and disconnection under feudal rule, the shared experience of violent rebellion forged strong bonds of solidarity among the peasants. The act of killing together, of collectively breaking the ultimate taboo of medieval society, created a new identity that transcended their previous status as mere serfs and laborers. Yet this same intensity that made peasant revolts so explosive also contributed to their ultimate failure. The violence was so severe, so shocking to contemporary sensibilities, that it often pushed away potential allies and justified equally brutal retaliation from the authorities. The peasants' rage, while understandable, often overshadowed any coherent political strategy, turning what might have been sustainable reform movements into brief explosions of chaotic destruction. The legacy of this violence extended far beyond the revolts themselves. The memory of peasant rage haunted the medieval ruling classes for generations, shaping their policies and their fears. The extreme violence served as a warning of what lay beneath the surface of feudal society, a brooding mass of resentment and anger that could explode at any moment if not carefully contained. In the end, the extreme violence of peasant revolts reflected not the brutality of the lower classes, but the brutality of the system that oppressed them. It was violence born from violence, hatred fueled by generations of oppression, and fury forged in the crucible of systematic dehumanization. The violence that erupted in these revolts was not a chaotic outburst of mindless rage. Instead, it was calculated brutality with a very specific goal. When peasants finally snapped, they did not just want to overthrow their oppressors. They wanted to humiliate them completely. They sought to strip away every last bit of dignity from the nobles, who had treated them like animals for generations. Consider this. These were not people who had been only mildly inconvenienced by their social betters. These were individuals who had been systematically dehumanized throughout their lives. They were told they were worth less than the livestock they tended, forced to watch their children starve while their lords feasted, made to grovel and beg for life's basic necessities. That kind of psychological torture does not just create anger. It breeds something much darker. It generates a deep need to inflict the same humiliation on those who caused it. So when the dam finally burst, peasants did not just kill nobles. They tortured them. They made them suffer in the most degrading ways possible. They forced lords to eat excrement. They skinned them alive. They made noble ladies watch as their husbands were butchered like pigs. Because for once, just once, they wanted their oppressors to feel what it meant to be humiliated. Welcome, friend, to this peaceful hour where we explore the layers of time. Tonight's story unfolds in a world different from ours, yet still deeply human. Whether you're drifting off or hoping to slow down your evening, I appreciate your presence. I'd love to hear where you're listening from, what city or country, and what time it is as you press play. It's amazing how history can connect strangers. If this calm, historical storytelling brings you peace, consider subscribing. We have many more stories to help ease us into the quiet night. Imagine standing in a medieval village at dawn. The mist clings to thatched roofs like a ghostly breath. In the distance, a church bell tolls with a heavy finality. But today is different. There's something electric in the air, something that makes even the bravest lord grip his sword a little tighter. The peasants are rising, and when they do, the aftermath will make the bloodiest battles between knights seem like children's games. But why? What drove these humble farmers, quiet shepherds, and weary laborers to such shocking acts of brutality? What changed gentle souls, who devoted their lives to growing crops and caring for animals, into vengeful forces that would frighten hardened warriors? Tonight, we will peel back the romanticized veil of medieval history and reveal the raw truth about peasant revolts. We will walk through the smoking ruins of manor houses, step over the bodies of nobles and commoners alike, and witness firsthand the shocking savagery that erupted when centuries of oppression reached their breaking point. Because here's what history books often miss about medieval peasant revolts: they weren't just uprisings or simple protests. They were explosive outbursts of rage that had been building for generations. When this rage finally found its voice, it spoke in a language of violence so extreme that it would fundamentally change European society. The violence wasn't just a side effect of these revolts. It was their defining trait. It was their weapon, their message, and their haunting poetry of revenge. For centuries, peasants had endured blow after blow, insult after insult, humiliation after humiliation. They watched their children starve while their lords feasted. They saw their daughters exploited by drunken nobles. They felt the overseer's whip for the crime of exhaustion. They buried loved ones lost to preventable diseases, because medicine was reserved for those who could pay. Yet, no matter how beaten down they were, the human spirit holds a terrible capacity for revenge. When peasants finally reached their breaking point, when their facade of submission cracked, what poured out wasn't just anger. It was a fury distilled over generations into something much more terrifying than simple rage. It was a form of justice as seen by those who had never experienced it, delivered by hands that had only known labor, now turned to instruments of retribution. These weren't calculated military campaigns led by professional soldiers or honor-bound conflicts between noble houses. These were desperate, merciless wars fought by people who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. In their arrogance, the nobles created an enemy they never expected. They faced a group that didn't follow their rules or respect their codes of chivalry, that didn't distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. They faced an enemy driven by the desperate fury of those who believed their cause was just, and armed with a deep understanding of every weakness in the oppressive system. When the revolts broke out, the resulting violence would make even the most brutal medieval battles look restrained. Peasants didn't just want to defeat their oppressors. They aimed to erase them. The violence during peasant revolts in medieval times was not merely a result of desperation. It was the unavoidable explosion of generations of pent-up rage and humiliation. When these uprisings finally emerged from the depths of feudal society, they brought a fury so intense that it shocked even the brutal standards of the time. To understand this violence, we must first acknowledge the psychological torment that led to it. For centuries, peasants faced not just poverty and hard labor, but also systematic dehumanization. They were beaten for minor offenses, publicly humiliated, and forced to watch as their meager harvests were taken while their children starved. Each encounter with their social superiors reinforced their status as less than human. This wasn't just economic exploitation. It was a deliberate attack on their dignity and humanity that built up like pressure in a sealed vessel. When the revolts finally erupted, they released this pent-up trauma in the most brutal way possible. The peasants didn't merely seek to overthrow their oppressors. They wanted to destroy them, to reverse the humiliation they had suffered.